The 5-Minute Photographer with Shelton Muller.
If you're relying solely on your camera to give you correct exposures 100% of the time, you may have found that that doesn't always turn out the way you think it should, and your pictures don't always turn out the way you expect them to. The scene may look something like this, but for some reason your camera has interpreted it to look like this. Now, this isn't the camera's fault. It's just doing what it's designed to do. What you and I need to do is understand how our camera meters, how it reads scenes, and how it suggests exposures. The meter in your camera is probably among the best available, but it has one inherent failing. It meters for reflected light, not incident light. In other words, it meters not for the light falling on the subject, but rather for the light reflected from it. Now think about that. Dark surfaces will reflect a lot less light than bright surfaces, and that will naturally affect how your camera meters for them. But imagine a bride in white and a groom in black. Now they will both meter completely differently, even though they're standing in exactly the same light. And that's why many professional photographers, even today, still use handheld meters to do what is called incident metering. That is, using a handheld meter to measure the light falling on the subject rather than the light reflected from it. And that makes a lot of sense. Reflected metering is designed to meter correctly provided your subject is a mid-gray. So dark things will often be overexposed because your camera thinks they should be gray. And bright things will often be underexposed because, again, your camera thinks they should be gray. The other problem is that your camera's meter does its best to read the entire scene and then suggest an exposure based on its computations for the whole frame. And different cameras work different ways. But not everything in the frame will be lit the same way. Sometimes there are very dark areas that fool the camera, and in other scenes there are very bright areas that fool the camera. So the elements within the frame that really matter can sometimes be under or overexposed, which is why we often need to set our cameras on manual and override the camera's exposure system. We need to disagree with it. And that's why your DSLR camera or your SLR camera will always or often come with an alternate metering setting such as center-weighted metering or spot metering. Center-weighted metering still calculates for the entire frame, but it prioritizes the center of the frame, which often overcomes the imbalances between a white sky and a dark foreground or the sun set in a landscape. Spot metering allows for a very small area within the frame and uses usually the focusing circle that's found in your viewfinder. It does rely on reflected metering, but it allows you to choose what you're metering for. This is very handy in performance photography because often there are very large, dark, black areas behind the performer that fool the camera into thinking it's very dark in here. But really, the subject is very brightly lit, usually with a spotlight. So if your camera has a spot metering facility, you can use this to meter for the face of the main performer. And for the same reason and in the same way, you can often take beautiful portraits indoors without having to resort to flash, simply by metering correctly. Often the person is illuminated enough for the photographer just to use the available light. Spot metering also allows you to select and meter for a part of the frame that's close enough to a mid-gray if you want to, which is often very handy for landscape photography. Now, our eyes can record detail in very bright and very heavily shadowed areas at the same time. However, film and your camera's digital sensor just can't, not at least to the same degree. Film and digital just don't have the same range as the human eye when it comes to retaining detail in bright highlights and dark shadows. So now, not only do you need to concern yourself with exposing correctly, you may have to actually decide what to expose for. Metering doesn't solve everything because your decision will sometimes mean that you lose detail in either the darker or the brighter parts of your picture, depending on what you've metered for. You can use fill flash, reflectors, graduated filters. You can shoot in RAW, do all of these things, but sometimes it still comes down to priorities. With digital images, it's always best to expose so that the bright parts of the image don't burn out too much. Once that happens, the detail can be irretrievable. Correct exposure affects not only the brightness or the darkness of your image, but also its sharpness, color saturation, contrast, and noise. And when all is said and done, nothing can replace accurate metering for quality in your images. I'm Shelton Muller, and this has been another episode of The 5-Minute Photographer.